Mall cop destroys artist's paintings. Gallery sells the ruins for $200,000. The next day. The first sound was a violation. A sharp, guttural rip that sliced through the cavernous quiet of the mall's forgotten wing. It wasn't just the sound of canvas tearing. It was the sound of a memory being murdered. A heart being flayed open for the second time. Elias Vance stood frozen. His own breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. 10 feet in front of him, a man in a cheap, ill-fitting security uniform was methodically destroying his life's work. Not with rage, not with the wild flailing anger of a man losing control. No, this was worse. This was a calm, deliberate, almost surgical dismantling. The man, whose name tag read Frank, pressed the Stanley knife into the painted face of Elias's wife, Lily, and drew it downward. The blade was obscenely bright under the yellowed fluorescent lights. It moved with a steady hand, a grim purpose. The canvas, once taut with the vibrant life Elias had poured into it, gave way with a sickening groan. A gash of stark, white emptiness appeared, bisecting Lily's laughing face. One eye, a swirl of cerulean blue and flecks of gold, now stared into a void. Frank grunted with satisfaction, the sound thick and wet in the echoing silence. He retracted the blade with a clean click, surveyed his handiwork, and then moved to the next painting. Elias's world had narrowed to that single, horrific point of focus. The glint of the blade, the pale scar on the canvas, the smug set of Frank's jaw, the shoppers, the distant synth-pop music, the faint, cloying smell of cinnamon from a Cinnabon, 2 corridors away, all dissolved into a low, meaningless hum. All that existed was the systematic execution of his love, his grief, his art. Just an hour earlier, the space had felt like a sanctuary. The Northgate Galleria was a dying beast, a relic of 90s consumerism clinging to life. The main concourse still had its chain stores and its shuffling crowds, but this western wing was a ghost town. Storefronts were sealed with corrugated metal gates, their faded logos Blockbuster, Radio Shack, Walden Books like tombstones of a bygone era. But the light here was perfect. Huge, triangular skylights, caked with years of grime, broke the afternoon sun into soft, hazy beams that slanted across the polished terrazzo floors. It was a cathedral of forgotten commerce, and in its center, Elias had built his shrine. He called it a pop-up gallery, though he knew it was just trespassing with style. He'd leaned 10 of his largest canvases against the shuttered storefronts, creating a semicircle of breathtaking, heartbreaking color. They were all of Lily. Lily with her head thrown back, laughing into a summer sky. Lily curled on a sofa, a book in her lap, her expression lost in thought. Lily, gaunt and pale but with an unyielding fire in her eyes, staring out from the sterile white of a hospital bed. He'd painted them all in the years since she was gone, locked in their small apartment that still smelled of her, of the jasmine tea she drank and the turpentine he used. The paint was his therapy, his confessional, his last conversation with her. Each brushstroke was a word he could no longer say. Each canvas was a day he refused to forget. He wasn't trying to sell them, not really. He had no money for a proper gallery, no connections in the art world. He just wanted them to be seen. He wanted strangers to walk by and see the woman he had loved, to feel a flicker of the light she had cast upon the world. So he'd carefully brought them here, one by one, in the back of his rusting Ford Fiesta, setting them up in this forgotten place where the light felt holy and the silence was respectful. He sat on a cold concrete planter, nursing a lukewarm coffee, a sketchbook lying unopened on his lap. A few people had wandered by, a pair of teenage girls in ripped jeans who whispered and pointed, their expressions unreadable. A young mother pushing a stroller, who slowed, her eyes lingering on the portrait of Lily in the hospital bed. A flicker of sad, knowing recognition on her face before her toddler whined and pulled her away. Elias didn't mind. It was enough that they looked. It was enough that Lily, for a moment, existed again in someone else's eyes. He felt a fragile peace settle over him. The first he'd felt in months. It was shattered by the squeak of rubber soles, and a voice that seemed too loud for any space. What in God's name is this mess? Elias looked up. The man was built like a refrigerator, his polyester uniform stretched taut over a formidable gut. A thick, grey mustache sat atop a perpetually downturned mouth. His eyes, small and dark, scanned the paintings not with curiosity, but with a kind of ingrained offense, as if their very existence was a personal insult. It's an art display, Elias said, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. He stood up, wiping his palms on his jeans. An art display, Frank repeated. the words dripping with derision. He took a step closer to the largest canvas, the laughing lily. He squinted at it. Looks like garbage to me. You got a permit for this? Garbage? A permit? No, I didn't think I needed one. It's an empty hallway. I'm not bothering anyone. Not bothering anyone. Frank's voice boomed, bouncing off the metal gates. You're creating a public nuisance. This is a fire hazard. It's an obstruction, and it's an eyesore. He gestured at the paintings with a dismissive wave of his hand. This is private property, son. You can't just set up your little finger painting project wherever you feel like it. A few shoppers, drawn by the commotion, began to slow their pace. A man in a suit on his phone, a couple of kids with skateboards, a woman with a cloud of white hair. They formed a loose, silent semicircle, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Elias felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He wasn't a confrontational person. He just wanted to be left alone. Look, I'm sorry. I can pack them up. It'll just take me a few minutes. You should have thought of that before you dumped all this depressing trash here, Frank said, his voice rising. He was playing to the crowd now, puffing out his chest, the petty tyrant on his pathetic throne. What is this stuff supposed to be, anyway? My kid could draw better than this. He jabbed a thick finger toward the portrait of Lily in the hospital. Her skin was translucent, her collarbones sharp beneath the thin cotton of her gown. Elias had captured the exhaustion, but also the fierce dignity that had burned in her until the very end. And this one, Frank scoffed. It's morbid. People come to the mall to feel good, to buy things they don't want to be reminded of. All this, he gestured vaguely at the painting's raw emotion. It's indecent. That's my wife, Elias said, the words barely a whisper. But they cut through Frank's tirade like a shot of glass. The small crowd shifted. A collective, quiet intake of breath. The woman with the white hair put a hand to her mouth. Frank paused, but only for a second. The information didn't soften him. It seemed to embolden him, giving him a new angle of attack. Your wife. Well, maybe you should have respected her enough to not plaster her all over a public walkway like some kind of advertisement for misery. The cruelty of it winded Elias. He felt the blood drain from his face. He could feel the eyes of the bystanders on him, their pity a heavy, suffocating blanket. He wanted the floor to swallow him whole. I'm taking them down, Elias said, his voice trembling slightly. Just give me a minute. You've had your minute, Frank declared, his hand going to the utility belt at his waist. This is unauthorized material on mall property. As head of security, I'm authorized to dispose of it. And that's when he pulled out the Stanley knife. The crowd gasped. The man on the phone lowered it, his mouth agape. One of the skateboard kids fumbled for his own phone, his thumb swiping frantically across the screen. No, Elias breathed, taking a step forward. Please, don't. Frank ignored him. He turned to the first painting, the laughing lily, and with the calm precision of an executioner, he pressed the blade to her cheek. That's when the world stopped. That's when the first, terrible, rip echoed through the hall. The aftermath was a graveyard. Frank, his duty done, had kicked the shredded canvases into a messy pile in the center of the floor, before marching off, his back ramrod straight. The crowd, their morbid curiosity satisfied, had dispersed, their whispers trailing behind them like ghosts. The skateboard kid, Chloe, had lingered the longest, her phone held steady, her face pale with shock, before she too melted back into the flow of the main concourse. Elias was alone. He sank to his knees amidst the wreckage. The smell of oil paint, once a comfort, now smelled like embalming fluid. He reached out a trembling hand and touched a fragment of a canvas. It was a piece of the hospital painting. Just a corner of the white pillowcase and a few strands of Lily's dark hair. The cut was so clean, so brutal. A sob, raw and ugly, tore itself from his chest. It was a sound he hadn't made since the day she died. He choked on it, his body shaking with a grief so profound it felt like it would shatter his bones. It was all gone. Not just the paint and the canvas, but the hours of memory, the painstaking effort to keep her alive, to honor her. Desecrated, turned into trash by a bitter man with a box cutter. He saw his future stretch before him, an empty apartment, a dead-end job washing dishes, a world leached of all its color. The fire that had driven him to paint, to create, had been extinguished. Frank hadn't just destroyed his paintings. He had destroyed his purpose. What was the point? What was the point of trying to create something beautiful in a world that allowed men like Frank to exist, to hold power, to tear beauty apart for sport? He closed his eyes, his forehead pressed against the cool terrazzo floor. He would gather the pieces, stuff them into a trash bag, and throw them in a dumpster. He would go home, sell his paints, and never pick up a brush again. The thought was a surrender, a final, blessed release from the pain of trying. He lay there for what could have been minutes or an hour. The light from the skylights began to shift, turning from gold to a soft, melancholy rose. He heard the slow, rhythmic squeak of wheels and the shuffling of feet. He didn't look up. He just wanted to be left to dissolve into the floor. A pair of worn work boots entered his field of vision. They stopped a few feet from his head. Elias tensed, waiting for another security guard. Another voice of authority telling him to clean up his mess. Instead, a disposable paper cup was placed gently on the floor beside his hand. It was filled with steaming black coffee. Elias slowly raised his head. It was Hector, the mall's elderly janitor. A man with a deeply lined face, kind eyes, and a stoop from decades of pushing a broom. Hector had seen Elias here before. He'd always just nodded, a silent acknowledgement, never saying a word. Now, he looked down at Elias, then at the pile of ruined canvases. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss," or "that guy was a jerk." He just looked at the mess, with a profound sadness in his eyes. Then he looked at one particular canvas, the one of Lily laughing, now split in two. He pointed a crooked finger at it. "The cut," Hector said, his voice raspy from disuse. "It makes her smile sadder, but you still see it. The smile is still there." Elias followed his gaze. He looked, really looked, at the destroyed painting for the first time, not as a symbol of his loss, but as an object in itself. Hector was right. The violent, diagonal slash across her face was a wound, a scar. But it didn't erase the joy in her eyes or the curve of her lips. In a strange, horrifying way, it amplified it. It told a new story. It was no longer just a portrait of Lily's joy. It was now a portrait of joy assaulted, of beauty brutalized but not extinguished. A new thought, fragile and strange, sparked in the darkness of his mind. The violence of the act, the clean cuts of the blade, the jagged edges of the canvas, they had become part of the art. Unintentional, vicious, but part of it. The paintings weren't just about Lily anymore. They were about what the world had done to her. And now, to her memory. He looked from the ruined canvas to Hector's kind, tired face, and then to the cup of coffee, a simple, profound act of human decency in the face of ugliness. He picked it up. The warmth spread through his cold fingers. He wasn't going to throw them away. Chloe didn't even think about it. The moment she got to the food court, her hands shaking, she uploaded the video. She was 15, and her world was mediated through a 4-inch screen. An injustice wasn't real until it was shared. A horror wasn't fully processed until it was validated by likes and comments. She chose the title carefully. Psycho Mall. Cop destroys veteran's art of his dead wife. She didn't know if Elias was a veteran, but it felt right. It felt like it had the right weight. She added a dozen hashtags. Hashtag Mall Cop Massacre. Hashtag Justice for Elias. Hashtag Northgate Galleria. Hashtag Art is not Okuri me. Hashtag Abuse of Power. Hashtag Heartbreaking. Then she posted it to TikTok, to Instagram Reels, to Twitter, and for good measure, to her dad's Facebook page. She expected a few dozen likes from her friends, maybe 100. What happened was a digital flash flood. The first wave came from Reddit. Someone cross-posted it to our public freakout, and our I am Otto Talpashifts. Within an hour, it had 10,000 upvotes. The comments were a torrent of pure, unadulterated rage. Fired. This guy should be charged with assault. You don't destroy a man's soul on camera and just get a pink slip. I'm a security guard. This is not procedure. This is a pathetic, impotent man on a power trip. He makes us all look bad. Does anyone know the artist's name? I want to buy his work. The second wave was Twitter. A well-known art critic with 2 million followers retweeted Chloe's video. Her commentary was succinct and devastating. This isn't vandalism. This is an act of iconoclasm against the human spirit. The raw, untutored emotion in these paintings is something you can't teach. The violence of their destruction is now part of their story. This is, unintentionally, one of the most powerful works of performance art I've ever seen. That's when the celebrity floodgates opened. Ava Sterling, an actress famous for her Oscar-winning roles and her fierce online activism, shared it with her 30 million followers. The face of petty tyranny, she wrote. Frank at Northgate Galleria thinks he's protecting public decency. What he's really protecting is his own cold, dead heart. Let's find the artist and show him what real decency looks like. Hashtag Mall Cop Massacre was the #1 trending topic in the United States. By midnight, the Northgate Galleria's corporate social media accounts were a nuclear wasteland. Their last post, a cheerful picture of a new pretzel stand, was buried under tens of thousands of comments demanding Frank's head on a platter. Major news outlets CNN, Fox News, the BBC were writing articles, embedding Chloe's shaky video, and sending reporters to the scene. Elias, oblivious, spent the night carefully, collecting the pieces of his life's work. He treated them like sacred relics, wrapping each shredded canvas in old bedsheets he'd brought from home. He worked under the dim emergency lighting, Hector silently helping him, his broom and dustpan clearing away the smaller, untethered fragments of paint and thread. By the time he got back to his apartment, the sun was a pale, gray smear in the sky. His phone, which he'd left on the charger, was glowing like a hot coal. He had 284 missed calls, hundreds of text messages, thousands of social media notifications. He stared at it, utterly bewildered. One text message, from a number he didn't recognize, stood out. "My name is Julian Croft. I own the Croft Gallery downtown. I saw the video. Do not touch the paintings. Do not try to repair them. I want them as they are. They are magnificent. Call me. We need to plan your exhibition." The power flip was swift and brutal. Karma, in the digital age, doesn't just knock. It kicks down the door with a SWAT team. The Northgate Galleria fired Frank Miller via a curt public statement. Released at 7 a.m., they offered their deepest apologies to the artist and the community and announced they were making a significant donation to a local arts charity. It was a desperate, clumsy act of damage control, and everyone saw it for what it was. A local news crew caught Frank leaving his modest suburban house. He was still wearing his security uniform, a detail that seemed particularly pathetic. The camera zoomed in on his face, no longer smug and authoritative, but pale, puffy, and bewildered. "They're crucifying me," he said to the reporter, his voice thick with a whiny self-pity. "All I did was my job. That stuff, it was obscene. It was filth. I was protecting the families, the children. I'm a guardian of public decency." The phrase guardian of public decency became an instant meme. Frank's face was photoshopped onto images of historical tyrants, of cartoon villains, of spoiled children having tantrums. He was no longer a person. He was a symbol of everything the internet loved to hate. His downfall was complete, public, and merciless. Meanwhile, Elias was sitting in a minimalist office that smelled of money and lemon-scented cleaner. Julian Croft was everything Frank Miller was not: sleek, tailored, and sharp as a shard of glass. He was in his late 40s, with silver hair and an energy that vibrated at a higher frequency than everyone else's. "They're not just paintings anymore," Elias Julian said, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming. "Don't you see? They're artifacts. They're evidence of a crime. They are a collaboration between you and that Neanderthal." He gestured around his gallery, a vast white space where a single, stark black sculpture stood under a spotlight. "People don't buy paintings, they buy stories. And my God, what a story this is. The grieving artist, the martyred wife, the brutal act of censorship, the digital uprising. It's perfect." Elias felt a wave of dizziness. "You want to display them like that? Broken." "Broken." Julian laughed, a short, sharp bark. "My dear boy, he didn't break them. He completed them. He gave them a second voice, a layer of violent commentary that you, with all your talent, could never have achieved. It's found art. It's a cultural moment. And so, the exhibition was born. Titled simply, The Miller Collection. It was the most anticipated art opening of the year. Julian's team worked with the precision of a bomb squad, mounting the shredded canvases in large, museum-quality shadow boxes. They were lit dramatically, each rip and tear casting its own shadow, becoming part of the composition. The centerpiece was the Laughing Lily. It was hung on a wall by itself. The two halves of the canvas were separated by a 6-inch gap, so the viewer had to stand back to see the whole image. The violent emptiness between the pieces, an unbridgeable chasm. One half of her smile, vibrant and full of life. The other, a memory connected only by a void. It was devastating. It was brilliant. It was the visual punch to the gut that Julian had promised. The opening night was a media circus. Elias dressed in a borrowed suit that felt like a costume, stood awkwardly in a corner, watching as the city's elite, the collectors, the critics, and the merely curious, moved through the space in a reverent hush. They stared at the ruined paintings with an intensity they would never have given the originals. They pointed at the clean cuts, the jagged tears, their brows furrowed with deep, intellectual appreciation. Red SOLD dots began to appear next to the pieces. First one, then three, then all of them. Julian floated through the crowd, a glass of champagne in his hand, a triumphant smile on his face. He found Elias by the wall. $212,000, Julian whispered, his voice giddy. And that's before the print rights. We've had offers from MoMA and the Tate for a traveling exhibition. You're not just an artist anymore, Elias. You're a phenomenon. Elias looked at the red dot next to the portrait of Lily in the hospital bed. The gash ran right through her chest. Someone had paid $40,000 for it. He felt a wave of nausea so profound he had to grip the wall to steady himself. He had gotten everything he never knew he wanted, all because his soul had been ripped apart in public. The twist didn't come from a journalist or a detective. It came from an anonymous email sent to the art critic who had first championed Ili's work. The critic, a woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation, a fact she found amusing, had been working on a long-form piece about the whole affair. The email was short. Subject: the real story of Frank Miller. You'd think he hated the art. You're wrong. You need to look into his wife, Martha Miller. She died 5 years ago. Look at what she did. Then you'll understand. Eleanor was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist before she became an art critic. Her instincts hummed. She started digging. It wasn't hard to find. Martha Miller had a small, forgotten digital footprint, an old Etsy shop, a defunct DeviantArt page. The images made Eleanor's blood run cold. Martha Miller had been a painter, a passionate, expressive, and deeply emotional painter. Her style was eerily similar to Elias's. She painted raw, unfiltered portraits, full of chaotic color and feeling. There were self-portraits filled with a desperate, searching sadness. There were landscapes that seemed to scream with a silent frustration. It was the work of a woman pouring her soul onto the canvas, trying to make sense of a world that didn't make sense to her. Eleanor kept digging. She found old public records, interviews with neighbors, a distant cousin of Martha's who was willing to talk. The story that emerged was a quiet tragedy. Martha had painted for years, her only joy in a life of quiet disappointments. But she'd never had a breakthrough. She'd faced rejection after rejection. And at home, she'd faced the constant, belittling disapproval of her husband. Frank. He hadn't understood her art. He'd called it a waste of time, a depressing mess. He'd complained about the cost of her supplies, the smell of the paint. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man of simple, rigid expectations. He wanted a normal wife with normal hobbies. He didn't know how to live with an artist. He didn't know how to support a dream he couldn't comprehend. So Martha, broken by the world's indifference and her own husband's scorn, had given up. She'd packed away her paints and fallen into a deep, listless depression. She died 3 years later from a sudden heart attack. But her cousin was adamant. Frank's complaining didn't kill her, she told Eleanor. The silence did. When she stopped painting, she started dying. Eleanor published her story. It didn't excuse what Frank had done, but it reframed it in a devastating new light. Frank Miller hadn't been destroying Elias's art. He had been destroying the ghost of his own wife. He saw in Elias's unsanctioned, public display of raw emotion everything he had crushed in Martha. He saw the passion he had belittled, the talent he had failed to nurture. He saw in Elias the man his wife had needed him to be, someone who would stand by her art, believe in it, even if no one else did. His rage wasn't about moral policy or public decency. It was a twisted, violent act of self-loathing, a desperate attempt to slash away the memory of his own profound failure as a husband. He was punishing Elias for succeeding where he and Martha had failed. The news hit Elias like a physical blow. He read the article in his apartment, surrounded by packing boxes and the lingering smell of fresh paint from the one new canvas he had allowed himself to start. He looked at the picture of Frank Miller's face, no longer a symbol of pure evil, but a mask of pathetic, tragic pain. The man wasn't just a villain. He was a victim of his own limitations, a prisoner of a grief and guilt so deep he had to lash out at a complete stranger to bear it. The money from the gallery, which had felt like a strange, hollow victory, now felt like blood money. It was the product of 2 broken hearts, 2 dead wives, 2 men drowning in their own separate oceans of grief. And then the phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. but he answered it anyway. "Mr. Vance." The voice was young, female, and trembling. "My name is Sarah Miller. Frank Miller is my father." Elias said nothing. He just listened to the sound of his own breathing. "I'm not calling to apologize for him," she said, her voice cracking. "What he did was monstrous. There's no excuse. But I read that article, and it's true. All of it. He never got over my mom. He never forgave himself. He's a broken man, Mr. Vance." She took a shuddering breath. "And now, he's lost everything. His job, his pension. We're going to lose the house. My mom's house." She started to cry, quiet, hopeless sobs. "I don't know why I'm calling you. I guess, I just thought you, of all people, might understand." Elias stood in his empty apartment. The check from Julian Croft for over $200,000 sitting on his kitchen counter. He looked at the blank canvas on his easel. He thought of the violent gash across Lily's laughing face. He thought of Martha Miller, packing away her brushes for the last time. He was rich because of this man's pain. This man who had desecrated his wife's memory. This man whose own wife had died of a broken spirit. Helping him felt wrong. A betrayal of Lily. A betrayal of himself. The temptation to let him rot, to let karma finish its perfect, brutal work, was a sweet, dark poison in his veins. It was what Frank deserved. But leaving his daughter, Sarah, to pay for her father's sins felt wrong, too. Leaving them to be homeless, to be swallowed by the same despair that had consumed Martha, felt like a victory for no one. It felt like continuing the cycle of pain, not ending it. What would Lily have done? The question was immediate and clear. Lily, who had spent her last months comforting the other patients in the cancer ward. Lily, whose compassion was as fierce and as boundless as her laughter. He knew what he had to do. It was the hardest choice of his life. At the press conference announcing the international tour of the Miller collection, Elias, no longer in a borrowed suit but in his own simple, paint-stained clothes, stepped up to the microphone. The flashbulbs were a blinding storm. He didn't talk about the money. He didn't talk about Frank Miller's spectacular fall from grace. He talked about Lily. He talked about her light, her strength, her belief that beauty was not a luxury, but a necessity. "An act of violence was committed against my work," he said, his voice quiet but steady, silencing the room. "But it did not destroy it. It changed it. It added a scar, and that scar tells a story. It tells the story of what happens when pain is met with more pain." He cleared his throat, his eyes finding the camera lens. "I'm using all the proceeds from this collection to launch a new foundation in my wife's name. It will be called the Lily Fund. It will provide grants and support to struggling artists, people who pour their souls into their work and are met with rejection or hardship. It's for anyone who has ever felt like giving up." He gave a small, sad smile. "The ugliest acts can create the most profound beauty. Cruelty always collects, but compassion is the only way to pay the debt." The next day, a check for $50,000 was anonymously donated to a legal fund set up for the family of Frank Miller. It was enough for them to keep the house. It was enough for a new beginning. Elias never saw Frank again. But sometimes, when he was working in the new, sun-drenched studio the foundation had provided for him, he would think of him. He wouldn't feel anger anymore. He wouldn't even feel pity. He would just feel a quiet, aching understanding of the complex, tragic, and sometimes beautiful ruins that we all carry inside us. Where are you reading this from? Drop your city, your state, your country. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next Justice Twist.